Some messages are louder when they are whispered than when they are shouted. On a cool Friday evening in downtown Chicago, the polished glass walls of Romano's Prime reflected the glow of passing traffic, while conversations floated gently beneath crystal chandeliers, and every employee knew the reservation under the name William Ashcroft meant one thing. The city's most respected and mysterious businessman had arrived. Few people knew how much influence he truly carried, but everyone recognized the calm confidence of the white-haired man in the perfectly tailored charcoal suit who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Across the dining room, Naomi Brooks adjusted the simple black apron over her crisp white shirt and quietly accepted table 12 after another server suddenly called in sick. At 42, the Black Maid who worked evenings cleaning and helping wherever she was needed had learned that dignity rarely came with applause. She smiled politely, filled water glasses before anyone asked, remembered every order without writing it down, and treated every guest with the same quiet respect, whether they wore expensive watches or work boots covered in dust. William barely noticed her during dinner as he discussed charitable investments and community redevelopment with two business partners, his attention fixed on contracts and long-term plans rather than the woman silently making sure every detail of the meal was perfect. Naomi never interrupted, never lingered, and never searched for recognition. Yet once, as she placed fresh coffee beside William's plate, their eyes met for the briefest second. Something flickered across her face. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition buried beneath years of restraint. William, however, looked away before the thought could settle. The dinner ended almost exactly 90 minutes after it began. His associates thanked the staff, gathered their folders, and waited near the entrance while William reached for the leather check presenter. He opened it with the same casual confidence he had shown 1,000 times before. The neatly printed receipt rested inside exactly where it belonged, but beneath the total, written in small, careful handwriting, were only 3 simple words. Remember Maple Street. William's fingers froze against the paper. The noise of clinking glasses faded into an indistinct murmur. His steady breathing faltered almost imperceptibly as his eyes remained fixed on those 3 words. He read them once, then again. The color drained from his face, replaced not by anger, but by something no one at the table had ever witnessed before, unmistakable disbelief. Without signing the receipt, without finishing his coffee, without offering a single explanation, he slowly closed the check presenter, stood from his chair, and quietly said, "We're leaving." His partners exchanged confused glances, instinctively following him toward the exit without asking questions. Restaurant employees stopped mid-step. Conversations softened. Even the pianist missed a note as dozens of curious eyes followed the unexpected departure. Naomi simply lowered her gaze and continued collecting empty dishes as though nothing unusual had happened, her expression calm, her movements unhurried. Yet somewhere behind those gentle eyes rested the weight of a memory that had waited many years for exactly this moment. The silence that followed William Ashcroft's departure lasted only a few seconds before whispers spread across Romano's Prime faster than the aroma of fresh coffee. Every employee had seen influential guests leave before, but never like that. There had been no raised voice, no complaint about the food, and no disagreement with the service. One quiet glance at a receipt had been enough to change everything. Restaurant manager Richard Collins hurried toward table 12 with concern written across his face. He opened the leather check presenter, expecting to find a billing mistake, but instead noticed the 3 handwritten words beneath the printed total. His expression tightened immediately. He looked across the dining room until his eyes settled on Naomi Brooks, who was calmly stacking empty plates with the same composed movements she had shown throughout the evening. Richard walked toward her without lowering his voice. He asked whether she had written on a guest's receipt, and Naomi answered honestly that she had. The manager looked stunned. He reminded her that employees were never supposed to leave personal messages for customers, especially someone whose reputation carried so much influence throughout the city. Nearby servers exchanged anxious glances. One hostess quietly whispered that Naomi had probably ended her own employment with a single pen stroke. Another employee wondered if the restaurant would lose an important client because of an unnecessary mistake. Yet Naomi neither defended herself nor argued. She simply apologized for placing Richard in an uncomfortable position and continued wiping the table as though every accusation weighed less than the memory she carried inside her heart. Richard asked what the 3 words meant, but Naomi gently replied that they were not intended for anyone except the man who had received them. That answer only deepened everyone's confusion. After the last guests left, the staff gathered in the service hallway, replaying the strange scene over and over. Some believed William would never return. Others expected lawyers or corporate representatives to call before sunrise. Richard reluctantly informed Naomi that he would need to file an incident report with the restaurant owner first thing in the morning because company policy required documentation whenever a distinguished guest departed under unusual circumstances. Naomi nodded with complete understanding. She accepted the possibility that she might lose the job she depended upon without showing resentment. She quietly changed out of her uniform, folded her apron with careful hands, and placed it inside her canvas bag before stepping into the cool Chicago night. As she walked toward the bus stop beneath rows of glowing streetlights, she never once looked back at the restaurant. Meanwhile, several miles away, William sat alone inside the back seat of his waiting sedan. His business partners had respectfully remained silent during the drive because they had never seen him so distant. The folded receipt rested in his hands. Again and again his eyes returned to those 3 simple words. They did not feel like a warning. They felt like a door, opening to a chapter of his life he had spent decades trying to bury. And for the first time in many years, the certainty that had always guided him gave way to a single unsettling question that refused to leave his mind. William Ashcroft did not return to his penthouse after leaving the restaurant. Instead, he instructed his driver to take the long route along the quiet streets bordering Lake Michigan, hoping the movement of the city would silence the memories that had suddenly awakened. It did not. The folded receipt remained in his hand as though it had become heavier with every passing mile. His driver had worked beside him for nearly 15 years and understood that silence was sometimes the greatest form of respect. William looked out through the window, watching reflections of streetlights glide across the glass. But his mind had traveled more than 2 decades into the past. Long before elegant offices, charitable foundations, and carefully tailored suits, there had been another version of himself. He had been a young man struggling to build an honest future after making countless mistakes that left him with little money and even less confidence. One rainy autumn evening, he had found himself standing alone on Maple Street after missing the last city bus. Cold, exhausted, and uncertain where life would lead, he had wandered into a small neighborhood diner lit by a faded neon sign. He remembered the comforting smell of fresh coffee, homemade soup, and warm bread. More clearly than anything else, he remembered a kind waitress named Eleanor Brooks, a woman whose smile carried the quiet strength of someone who believed every stranger deserved dignity. She noticed immediately that the young man sitting alone had counted every dollar before ordering the least expensive meal on the menu. Without embarrassing him, she quietly brought him an extra bowl of soup and a slice of homemade pie, insisting that the kitchen had prepared too much food that evening. William knew even then that she had invented the explanation simply to protect his pride. As he prepared to leave, ashamed that he could barely afford the check, Eleanor folded the receipt and smiled warmly, before saying, "When life finally becomes kind to you, remember Maple Street." Those words had followed him through the years like a distant echo. Yet as success arrived, meetings multiplied, responsibilities expanded, and entire chapters of his life quietly disappeared beneath achievement. He had never returned to that little diner. He had never learned what became of the woman who had shown unexpected kindness to a struggling stranger. Now those same 3 words had appeared on another receipt written in another careful hand. William slowly unfolded the paper once more, tracing the familiar handwriting with his fingertips even though he knew it belonged to someone else. The coincidence felt impossible. Meanwhile, across the city, Naomi Brooks unlocked the modest apartment she shared with her elderly aunt. She greeted her with a gentle smile, prepared warm tea, and asked about her evening medication before quietly placing her canvas bag beside the kitchen table. Hidden inside the front pocket rested an old family photograph that Naomi had carried for years. Before going to bed, she removed the faded picture and looked at the smiling woman standing beside a tiny neighborhood diner beneath a weathered sign that simply read Maple Street Cafe. Naomi softly whispered, I hope he finally remembered you, Mom. Before placing the photograph back into its protective envelope, unaware that the memory her mother had trusted her to preserve had finally reached the man it had always been meant to find. Sunrise arrived with a pale golden light stretching across Chicago, but William Ashcroft had barely slept. The receipt remained on his desk beside untouched coffee, its folded edges beginning to soften from being opened so many times during the night. Shortly after 7 o'clock, he instructed his executive assistant to postpone every morning appointment until further notice. It was the first time in years that he had cleared an entire schedule without offering an explanation. Instead of walking into another boardroom, he opened a secure storage cabinet containing dozens of carefully labeled boxes filled with documents from earlier chapters of his life. He searched patiently through faded photographs, handwritten journals, and old correspondence until he uncovered a small envelope marked simply with the name Maple Street. Inside rested a yellowed receipt from the neighborhood diner he had visited more than 20 years earlier. Although time had faded the ink, one sentence remained unmistakably clear. Remember Maple Street. William closed his eyes. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor Brooks. There could no longer be any doubt. The woman at Romano's prime had not chosen those words by accident. Across the city, Naomi Brooks followed the same routine she had repeated for years. She prepared breakfast for her elderly aunt, carefully organized her medications, and left the apartment carrying the same worn canvas bag. During the bus ride, she quietly watched families beginning their day, never imagining that someone else was retracing memories connected to her own. She arrived at the restaurant early as always, greeted every co-worker with kindness, and immediately began arranging silverware before customers arrived. Richard Collins approached her with a gentler expression than the evening before. He explained that the restaurant owner had reviewed the incident report and decided to wait before making any employment decision because no complaint had been filed. Naomi thanked him sincerely and returned to work without asking another question. Her calm acceptance left Richard even more puzzled. By late morning, William contacted the city's historical records office, requesting archived business licenses connected to Maple Street Cafe. Within an hour, digital copies confirmed what his memory had begun to suspect. Eleanor Brooks had owned the small diner until it closed many years earlier. One additional document caught his attention. An obituary published several years after the restaurant closed mentioned that Eleanor was survived by a daughter named Naomi Brooks. William slowly leaned back in his chair, absorbing every word. The woman who had quietly served him dinner was not simply someone who knew an old story. She was the daughter of the person whose unexpected kindness had changed the direction of his life during its darkest season. At that same moment, Naomi helped an elderly customer carry a tray to a nearby table and accepted a heartfelt thank you with her familiar warm smile. She never mentioned her mother, never spoke about the past, and never expected recognition. She believed some acts of kindness belonged to memory rather than reward. William looked once more at the receipt resting beside the obituary before making a decision unlike any he had made in years. This time he would not send an assistant, a manager, or a representative. If answers were waiting, he understood that only one person should ask the questions, and only one person should finally say the words that had remained unspoken for more than 2 decades. The following afternoon, William Ashcroft walked into Romano's prime alone, leaving his driver outside and asking his security team to remain in the car. The familiar dining room looked exactly as it had the night before, yet everything felt different. Every polished table, every quiet conversation, and every beam of sunlight reflecting through the tall windows seemed to remind him that life often hid its greatest lessons inside ordinary moments. Richard Collins immediately recognized him and hurried forward with visible concern, expecting another uncomfortable conversation about the unusual departure. Instead, William politely asked one simple question. He wanted to know whether Naomi Brooks was working that day. Richard hesitated before pointing toward the far side of the restaurant, where Naomi was carefully arranging fresh flowers at an empty table before the lunch crowd arrived. She looked up as footsteps approached and immediately recognized the man standing before her. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. William held the folded receipt in one hand, while Naomi quietly rested the vase she had been carrying on the table. There was no fear in her expression, only calm patience. William finally broke the silence by asking why she had written those 3 words. Naomi answered softly that her mother had spoken them many times throughout her life. Eleanor Brooks believed kindness should never disappear simply because years had passed. She often wondered whether the young man she had once encouraged had found a better future, and before she passed away, she asked Naomi to remember those words in case life ever created an unexpected opportunity. Naomi explained that she had recognized William almost immediately from newspaper photographs and community events. She had hesitated throughout the entire dinner because she did not wish to embarrass him or interrupt his evening. In the end, she decided to write only the 3 words her mother had treasured, trusting that if they meant nothing, he would simply ignore them, but if they still carried meaning, he alone would understand. William listened without interrupting. His eyes slowly lowered toward the receipt before he admitted that he had never forgotten Eleanor's kindness, although he had failed to honor it. He confessed that the encouragement she offered during one difficult evening had given him enough hope to keep pursuing an honest future instead of surrendering to despair. Naomi smiled gently and told him that her mother never expected repayment. She believed every act of compassion became meaningful only when it inspired another act of compassion. Those words settled heavily inside William's heart. For years he had measured success through buildings restored, businesses expanded, and charitable donations announced at public events. Yet standing before the daughter of the woman who had quietly changed his life, he realized that none of those accomplishments could equal the value of one simple meal served with dignity to a discouraged stranger. The dining room seemed to fall silent around them as William looked directly at Naomi and admitted something he had never imagined saying aloud. He thanked her for carrying her mother's kindness across 2 decades and confessed that he had come not as an important businessman, but as a grateful man who finally understood that the greatest debts could never be settled with money alone. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, touched by William's gratitude but unwilling to let the conversation become about admiration for her family alone. She quietly explained that her mother had believed kindness only mattered when it continued from one person to another. Eleanor had often said that a meal could satisfy hunger for an hour, but respect could nourish someone for a lifetime. Those words settled between them with a quiet strength that neither expensive surroundings nor successful careers could overshadow. William looked around the elegant dining room and realized that although he had funded schools, restored historic buildings, and supported countless charitable programs, he had never searched for the woman whose simple generosity had first convinced him that his future still held value. The realization did not fill him with shame as much as responsibility. He asked Naomi whether there was anything he could do to honor her mother's memory. Naomi smiled gently before answering that the greatest tribute would not be a gift to her, but an opportunity for others who found themselves standing where William had once stood. She told him that every week she met hardworking people who skipped meals so their children could eat first, students who worked 2 jobs while attending community college, and elderly neighbors who quietly counted every dollar before entering a grocery store. Many of them carried the same uncertainty her mother had recognized in a young stranger years before. William listened carefully without interrupting. For the first time in many years, he felt that someone was speaking to him without expecting influence, donations, or recognition. Naomi simply spoke from experience, never asking for anything in return. Richard Collins, standing several steps away, had witnessed enough of the conversation to understand that something extraordinary was unfolding. The concern that had filled the restaurant the previous evening gradually gave way to curiosity, and then to quiet respect. William finally nodded and thanked Naomi once again before asking whether she would allow him to learn more about her mother's life. Naomi reached into her canvas bag and carefully removed the faded photograph she carried every day. It showed Eleanor Brooks standing proudly outside Maple Street Cafe with the familiar welcoming smile William remembered so clearly. William accepted the photograph with trembling hands, not because it held monetary value, but because it preserved a moment of humanity that success had never been able to purchase. He returned the photograph immediately after studying it, promising that he would never again allow gratitude to remain trapped inside memory alone. Before leaving, he paid the restaurant bill from the previous evening, added a generous tip for the entire staff rather than for one individual, and thanked every employee he passed on his way to the door. Nobody spoke as he walked out into the afternoon sunlight. Naomi quietly returned to arranging tables for the lunch guests, serving each customer with the same patience and warmth she had always shown. Yet something invisible had changed. William stepped onto the sidewalk, understanding that influence meant very little unless it lifted someone else with dignity. While Naomi watched another family enter the restaurant with the peaceful confidence that her mother's kindness had finally completed the journey it had begun more than 20 years earlier. Over the next several days, William Ashcroft found himself returning to thoughts of Maple Street more often than to the reports waiting on his desk. Every meeting felt shorter than usual because his attention kept drifting toward a single realization. Eleanor Brooks had never changed his life through wealth, influence, or connections. She had changed it by treating a discouraged stranger with quiet respect when no one else had noticed him. That lesson had been buried beneath years of success, and now it demanded to be lived instead of merely remembered. Rather than announcing a public campaign or inviting reporters to witness another charitable donation, William chose a different path. He contacted the directors of his family foundation and instructed them to create a confidential assistance program for restaurant workers, students with part-time jobs, and individuals facing temporary financial hardship. He insisted that every application remain private because dignity should never require public attention. When his advisors suggested attaching his family name to the program, William declined without hesitation. He explained that the greatest kindness he had ever received had arrived without cameras, speeches, or expectations, and he intended to honor it in exactly the same way. Meanwhile, life at Romano's Prime continued much as it always had. Naomi Brooks greeted every customer with patience, remembered regular guests by name, and quietly encouraged new employees who struggled through their first busy lunch shifts. She never mentioned her conversation with William unless someone asked directly, and even then she spoke only about her mother's belief that compassion could travel farther than anyone imagined. Richard Collins noticed a subtle change among the staff. Servers who had once hurried past tired coworkers now offered to help carry heavy trays. Hosts became more attentive to elderly guests. Small gestures of consideration began appearing throughout the restaurant without anyone realizing they had all been inspired by the same quiet conversation. One afternoon, William returned once again, not for a private meeting, but simply for lunch. He requested an ordinary table near the window instead of the secluded dining area reserved for prominent guests. When Naomi approached with a menu, he smiled warmly and thanked her as though greeting an old friend. During the meal, he noticed a young dishwasher nervously dropping a stack of clean towels while rushing between the kitchen and storage room. Instead of ignoring the moment, William stood, helped gather the towels, and offered the young man an encouraging smile before returning to his seat. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, yet several employees paused in surprise because they had never seen someone of William's stature behave with such natural humility. Naomi watched quietly from across the room. She understood that gratitude had finally become action. As William prepared to leave, he placed the check inside the leather presenter without writing another message. This time no words were necessary. Naomi opened it only after he had walked through the front doors. Inside rested the payment, a generous tip shared equally among the staff, and a small handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to become." Naomi folded the note carefully and slipped it into the same envelope that protected her mother's photograph, knowing that some memories deserved to be carried forward because they continued changing lives long after the moment itself had passed. Several weeks passed, and the quiet changes William Ashcroft had set into motion began reaching people he would never personally meet. A single mother received emergency assistance that allowed her to remain in school while supporting her young son. A college student working late restaurant shifts was able to purchase textbooks without choosing between tuition and groceries. An elderly dishwasher quietly accepted help with medical expenses after believing for months that retirement would never be possible. None of them knew where the support had originated, and that was exactly how William intended it to remain. Every application was reviewed with one guiding principle written at the top of the foundation's internal policy: preserve dignity first. Those 3 words became as important to him as the 3 words Naomi had written on the restaurant receipt. One afternoon, William invited Naomi to meet him at a small neighborhood park only a few blocks from where Maple Street Cafe had once stood. Time had replaced the old diner with new buildings, but a stone marker describing the neighborhood's history remained beside a line of maple trees. Naomi arrived carrying the familiar canvas bag that had become part of her daily routine. William greeted her with sincere warmth before showing her a carefully framed photograph that had recently been restored by a historical preservation company. It was the same picture of Eleanor Brooks standing proudly outside her cafe, now cleaned and protected behind clear glass. William explained that he had tracked down the original negative through the city's historical archive and wanted to ensure that Eleanor's memory would never fade again. Naomi looked at the restored photograph with quiet emotion. For a moment, she could almost imagine her mother's welcoming voice echoing across the sidewalk once more. William then revealed another decision. He had arranged for a scholarship in Eleanor Brooks's name to assist students pursuing careers in hospitality, nursing, education, and community service, professions built upon caring for others without expecting recognition. Naomi remained silent before softly saying that her mother would have loved the idea, because she always believed the greatest investment anyone could make was in another person's future. They sat together on a nearby bench as families walked through the park, and children laughed beneath the shade of the maple trees. There was nothing formal about the afternoon. No reporters arrived. No photographers waited nearby. It was simply two people connected by one act of kindness that had survived more than 20 years. Before leaving, William handed Naomi a small envelope. Inside was not a check or an expensive gift, but a copy of the original receipt Eleanor had given him decades earlier, carefully preserved inside protective glass beside the words she had written. Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude and explained that she would keep it beside her mother's photograph so future generations of her family would understand that compassion could travel farther than anyone expected. As they stood to leave, William looked once more at the place where Maple Street Cafe had once welcomed strangers and realized that buildings could disappear, businesses could close, and years could pass. Yet one sincere act of respect could continue shaping lives long after everything else had changed. As another autumn arrived in Chicago, Romano's Prime remained busy with familiar faces and new visitors. Yet one small frame hanging near the entrance quietly drew the attention of those who paused long enough to read it. It contained a simple photograph of Eleanor Brooks beside Maple Street Cafe and a short inscription that read, "One act of kindness can outlive a lifetime." Most guests smiled politely before continuing to their tables, never realizing that the words represented a promise fulfilled across 2 generations. Naomi Brooks continued serving every customer with the same gentle patience that had always defined her. She never spoke about the scholarship, the foundation, or the quiet changes taking place throughout the city unless someone specifically asked. To her, kindness lost nothing by remaining ordinary. William Ashcroft visited the restaurant from time to time, always requesting the same table near the window and always greeting every employee by name. His reputation in business remained strong, but those who worked closest to him noticed something even more meaningful. He listened longer before making decisions. He thanked people more often than before. He walked through offices without expecting special treatment, and he quietly reminded young executives that every successful organization was built by people whose names rarely appeared in headlines. Months later, the first recipient of the Eleanor Brooks Scholarship graduated from community college and accepted a position as a registered nurse. Another recipient completed culinary school and returned to Chicago to open a neighborhood cafe where no customer in need would ever be turned away hungry. Neither graduate had ever met Eleanor Brooks, yet both carried forward the values she had lived every day without seeking recognition. One quiet afternoon, Naomi visited the park where Maple Street Cafe had once stood. She carried the restored photograph of her mother, the preserved receipt William had kept for more than 20 years, and the handwritten note that read, "Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to become." She placed them side by side on the bench and smiled, realizing that none of them represented an ending. They were simply reminders that compassion could continue traveling from one heart to another long after the original moment had passed. At nearly the same hour, William stood inside his office looking through the window toward the Chicago skyline. The framed copy of Eleanor's receipt rested beside family photographs instead of business awards. Whenever difficult decisions appeared before him, he no longer asked which choice would bring the greatest success. He asked which choice would preserve another person's dignity. The answer was usually much simpler than he once believed. Years after 3 handwritten words had appeared beneath the total on an ordinary restaurant receipt, neither William nor Naomi measured their lives by wealth, recognition, or influence. They measured them by the quiet difference one respectful gesture could make in the life of a stranger. The receipt remained carefully protected, the photograph remained proudly displayed, and the memory of Maple Street continued opening doors that no amount of money could ever unlock. And on every life touched by that simple chain of compassion, the quiet legacy of Eleanor Brooks lived on, proving that genuine dignity is never purchased, never demanded, and never forgotten.